Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of ELTAI, I welcome you all for this webinar on Diaspora, Globalization through the lens of Modernism. So before we move on to the webinar, I request you to watch the prom clip of ELTAI. So thank you very much for watching the prom clip on ELTAI. I have a few announcements to the audience. One, we have a chat facility here where you can share your ideas, and during the question answer time, you can ask your questions there. You can type your questions. Your questions will be answered by the speaker. I request you not to share your personal details there, like your phone numbers or email IDs. Another point is people who, worry about your certificates. So people who attend the webinars will get your certificate on time. Thank you. So with this, I hand over the section to Dr. Asha. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Praveen. Good evening, one and all. A very warm welcome to all the participants attending yet another session of this marathon learning experience offered by ELTAI India. This is the 60th webinar conducted in the wake of COVID crisis since last year. It is my proud privilege to introduce the speaker for today's session, Professor Jasbir Jain, the doyen of literature, an ideal teacher, an avid researcher, and a prominent critic and one of the most cited authors of today. Professor Jain is an encyclopedia of knowledge. Words of wisdom pour out of every utterance of hers. Each moment of interaction with her is a blessing. No words would suffice to describe the love, care, and motivation she showers upon students, scholars, and friends, both home and abroad. Professor Jasbir Jain is former professor and head Department of English, University of Rajasthan, Jaipur. She is the founder director of Institute of Research in Interdisciplinary Studies, IRIS, Jaipur. She has been Director of Academic Staff College, University of Rajasthan, Jaipur. She has officiated in several other capacities too. Professor Jain has travelled widely and has been a recipient of several fellowships and awards. She is Professor Emeritus, Sahitya Academy Fellow, Fulbright Fellow, K.K. Birla Fellow, and elected member of Clare Hall, Cambridge, amongst many others. She has received the South Asian Literary Association Award, International Association for Canadian Studies Award, and was nominated Global Fellow by American Association of Colleges. She has written and edited several books and authored several articles. Her recent publications include 3 volumes on Indian novels, Indigenous Roots of Feminism, Culture, Subjectivity and Agencies, Theorizing Resistance, Forgiveness Between Memory and History, Diaspora Writes Home, Subcontinental Histories, and the latest one being Interpreting Cinema, which came out in 2020. I am sure that the takeaway from the present discourse titled Diaspora Globalisation through the lens of modernism will initiate profound pedagogical deliberation among students, teachers and researchers as diaspora studies figure in most of the university syllabi and is a subject of continued interest. I extend a warm welcome and invite you, ma'am, to take over the proceedings.
Are you not going to introduce Preeti? Shall I begin?
I'll do it after you finish your lecture.
Do you want me to begin?
Yes, yes.
Okay, because I understood that perhaps you're introducing Preeti also.
Oh, yes, ma'am. I'll introduce her after you are finished with your...
Okay, understood. Yes. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here, and especially Professor Mohan Raj, Dr. Sanjay Arora, and Dr. Bandana Chakravarti for pulling me out of my hibernation. I was very reluctant to give webinars because I find them a little strenuous. I like to speak to a live audience, but I've spoken already a couple of times, so this is another experience which will perhaps be very welcome. So today my subject is a 3-segmented one. There's diaspora, there's globalization, and there's modernism. Many of you might still remember, or you may not have experienced, older brothers and sisters may have experienced, about 50 years ago there used to be a viewmaster, like binoculars that children used. And there was a place in the middle where you could slide in a slide which had 6 or 7 photographs. By that you went to various parts of the world. They were on animals, on geography, on various things. So my subject today is like that. All 3 of them have not been born simultaneously. All 3 of them have not the same working condition. They have, although all of them are connected with politics and power and economy. And out of them, diaspora is the oldest one. The history of the diaspora goes back to the 5th, 6th century BCE, before Common Era. That is a long way off. And we normally, when we think of the diaspora, we think of the present. We think of V.S. Naipaul. We think of Amitav Ghosh. We think of Cyril Debicki and writers like that. We don't go back into the past to understand where the diaspora began and what is the meaning of diaspora. the Greek word dispersing means scattering. Obviously, if there's a scattering, scattering should take roots, and there should be a firmness of commitment, of national loyalty, which perhaps is missing sometimes in the diaspora. But the Hebrew word is exile. The meaning of the diaspora in Hebrew is exile. And I would like you to remember this, that exile is a very important part of the diaspora. I want to open the past history so we understand how it has been transformed and how it contributes to globalization and how globalization affects it and how modernism has been one of its offspring. When we go back to the past, first there were the Jews who were freed from the Babylonian captivity. When you go back to the Old Testament, you also read about the Exodus, when Moses took the group outside from there. It was a kind of a disbanding of Jerusalem. And looking after that, the Jews have not had a homeland till Israel was born in the 20th century. And the history of the Jews has been very, it has been torturous. It has been one of constant escape and running from one place to another. And the Second World War and Hitler's persecution of them was perhaps the worst experience. There must have been others in the past which we don't really remember. They are not so close to us as this is. So the diaspora has begun with that. But when we look at the history of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, slavery was the origin of diaspora, African slaves. All along, we see that there's a balance between powerful imperial countries and poor underdeveloped countries. And that's the scale in which the diaspora is weighed. And then as we go along, the 20th century and 21st century, which is about 21 years have passed, but it is also part of it, we find that the diaspora now is a refugee. We have the Tibetan refugees with us, we have the Sri Lankan refugees with us, we have the Myanmar refugees with us, and before that we have Chinese settlements. So we have many settlements of the Tibetans. One major one is in Dharamsala. So 4 major rehabilitation centers were started in which the diaspora were kept Tibetans. Now, one thing is sure to strike you, that these people like Tibetans, refugees, etc., they're homeless and they are countryless and they have only memories to share. They may have partitions also, partition of Vietnam, partition of Korea, partition of India, and other partitions are also responsible for the diasporas. And people have left their own homelands and migrated to other places. I remember once I went to South Korea and one could travel across to the border and the train would stop at a certain junction where we could have a look into North Korea. And the ideologies of both are very different. So this is another important point. For diaspora, ideology is also important. In our own subcontinent, we have the Muhajirs in Pakistan. We have people in India who have left their homes in Pakistan and their lands, their memories of their ancestors, and they have come to India because they were fleeing away from the terrors of the riots. These are political decisions, partitions of the country, where the power is not with the people themselves. The power is from somebody else. Whether they're accepted or rejected, or whether this home audiences, whether the home audience is hospitable or not, or hostile, that is an entirely different thing. And one must remember that hostility of the host country, which is not like we are, in a way, inhospitable to the Myanmar refugees. We are not very hospitable to them, though we were relatively hospitable to the Tibetan refugees and the Sri Lankan refugees. So perhaps many of us have never looked at them as diaspora, but they are all diaspora because they are people who have been moved out of their homelands, out of their nations, out of their countries, and have been pushed into another environment completely. So diaspora has a very long history. Next comes modernism. But I'm not going to trace the history of modernism here. I'll take it forward later on, but I'm telling you that it preceded globalization. It preceded globalization, modernism, both as a movement and modernization as a technological advancement. They have come much later. They have come, in my analysis, I would place it in the 16th century with Martin Luther's Protestant Revolution. That was the first step towards modernism, when the individual was freed from papal authority. And there was a direct desire for a direct relationship with God, communication with the Bible, the word of the God. Sikhism, when it came into being, was another such step, which was moving away from blind faith, but toward the analysis of faith and establishment of new ideas. These are all events of the earlier period, 16th century. And of the 6th century, 16th century. Then we move to globalization. I'm taking you through the different segments so you can use the lens of modernism to start looking at the diaspora and globalization. Globalization is a post-Second World phenomenon. Apparently, it came into being with the United Nations organizations, with the World Trade Organization, WTO, and a kind of bringing countries together, which meant economy was being labeled to, roped in to work together for all countries. It was not all that effective, and perhaps it didn't influence us so that much, because third world countries and third world seas have been used for dumping in the affluent and of industrial affluent, so much so that fish and prawns have been affected. And when the Environment Summit was held, at that time we realized how unequal is our voice. So globalization might be making Levi's jeans available to you in India, but globalization has not really given us equal rights if we want it to be there. And this past year, Corona has shown us that globalization has this terrible face. Terror is also there. Like the economy is upset because of the virus. Economy all over the world is upset. Travel is upset. The modernization and that came with the aeroplane and travel and compressing of time, that you could travel instead of taking 3 months or 2 months to go to England, you could go in 11 hours. You could go in 17 hours to USA. when visa becomes a problem, when your passport is essential to visit a country, and if you don't belong there, you can't go. That's what's happening now. If you don't have a passport to Germany, you can't go to Germany because there's strict restrictions. So globalization has its negative side also in times of crisis. Where do we go? You can't run away. Just as people from the former Burma, Myanmar, can't come to India unless the Indian government is welcoming them. The Citizens Act has come partially to control the incoming outsiders. So the word outsider is very, very important, very, very important, because the diaspora is an outsider in a society. And what are the handicaps of the outsider? Place the blacks in America. There's racial discrimination. There's economic inequality. There's political inequality. There are no equal rights. It's only at the end of the 19th century, after the Civil War, that some voices have risen. We have Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. You have later on, 60 years later, you have Toni Morrison. You have many black writers. You have a black revolution in the 1950s and 1960s. The whole desire to adopt and acclimatize the African culture. I remember Lorraine Hansberry's playing A Raisin in the Sun. But do they go back? Adrian Kennedy went to South Africa, went to Africa, not South Africa. And many others went there, Alex Haley, in search of roots. But they didn't stay there, they came back. Another thing that we must remember is the diaspora hardly ever comes back. They talk about homecoming, they talk about memory, they talk about history, but they never come back. This is a point I want to stress, that the difference in the host society and the outsider. Memory is different, history is different, culture is different, myths and symbols are different, and the languages are sometimes different, and communication levels are limited. And most of all, they are poor. When they come in, they are suppressed, they are slaves, or they are servants, or they are occupied in hard labor. And indentured labor was the same thing. Indentured labor, even there was discrimination between the Africans and the Indians, because the Africans were already there when the Indians landed there. So we find that this dichotomy is there. The outsider is hardly ever welcome. He's always on the margin, and he's the diaspora. He has to struggle very hard in order to make himself in a position of importance or acceptance. Let me put it acceptance. That is one thing. Now I go back to modernism. Now modernism has its own perspective. I'm glad for whoever gave us this subject that modernism is brought in, because modernism does show us where modernism began. Modernism began with the outsider sensibility, with questioning. Modernism has various roots. Going back to the French Revolution, there is the rise of the proletariat and against monarchy, desire to change the political social system, and there's also at the same time violence. So these two things have gone together, power and opposition to power with violence. The violence in the French Revolution partly is the source of the fascist and Nazi movements later on. Because when we read literature about the French Revolution, we realized that there was an awakening in society and they were no longer willing to accept the hegemony of the bourgeois. Even the bourgeois, not only the monarchy. So in Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, the siege of Bastille is very important, which is how the crowd rushed in from the streets into the prisons and freed the prisoners. So that's one aspect of a rising. How does it give rise to modernism? Because the reality of the felt lower class, or the felt outsider, the felt immigrant, and the felt indentured labor is very different from what he confronts in society outside. Modernism is a split between external reality and inner reality. We have been trained perhaps to look at modernism through literary eyes. But more than literary eyes, it is a philosophical and a psychological movement. And in this, I go back to the 19th century. Hugh MacFarlane and Malcolm Bradbury, both in their modernism, have said that modernism was a movement divided at heart. On one side was the progress, big cities coming up, stock exchanges coming up. On the second side, the other side was the isolated individual, alienated individual who couldn't find his own way, who was perhaps living alone in a city, had no ties, has lost his family. Bring them to the diaspora, apply them to the diaspora. The first gender migrations were single gender, mostly single gender migrations when we look at the African slaves. This man, Caleb Phillips' novel, Crossing the Bar, is a story of three siblings, but he has placed them in three different periods of time and three different locales. One brother is with a missionary and he's sent back to Africa to become a missionary. One sister is in America where she's sold as a slave, and she's later on in the 20th century shown as an old woman. We also have the slave captain, the ship captain's diary, which tells us about the slave when he's writing home to his wife what he feels. And then there's the third sibling who's shown in the Second World War in Britain and in a different economic circumstance. I'm referring to Carol Phillips to show that it is also diaspora. Racial discrimination was part of the diaspora, whether it was Nigeria or whether it was England or whether it was America or whether George Floyd's case is very recent in human memory. And all of you are familiar with that discrimination carrying on even after the 60s, 62, the militant revolution after the Vietnam War against the US authorities. The blacks wanting equal rights. Earlier there was equality but segregation, but now it's all, they were pushing for equal rights, not separate buses or separate seats, but walking shoulder to shoulder and staying with them. And then we find that the indentured labor, especially from the Caribbean, the Jahazi Bhai, they are referred to as Jahazi Bhai. They migrated to other migrations, either to England or to Canada or to other places where they were looking for new identity and not just subordinate identity. All this gave birth to modernism because the divided consciousness, the lost memories, the desire for pulling back into history and creating an identity and taking the uncertainty of time and changing it into some stability. So modernism is also a question of time. It's a question of philosophy. It's a question of faith. Why do I mention faith? It would not have come into place if there hadn't been an erosion in faith. When church going had not been reduced, when people had not started asking questions about the superpowers of the supernatural or superpowers of God. Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher. Many of you will be familiar with Fear and Trembling. It's a very, very, very powerful narration of Abraham going with Isaac and with his son, whether God wants him to sacrifice him or not, and all the way he thinks. He hasn't told his wife, he hasn't told his son Isaac, and he tells him, he thinks, should I tell him? Should I not tell him? Does God really want me to kill my son? Or does God only expect me to make a token of it? Thrice he stops on the way, thrice he thinks about it. That is the beginning of modernism, where questioning starts. Martin Luther, that's the questioning of modernism, beginning of modernism. And then we find here, as we go along, that many of these people, there's the inner consciousness, the psychological novel, existential philosophy. You may be familiar with Albert Camus, his Outsider. Look at the title, The Outsider. And the first sentence of the novel is, my mother died today, or maybe yesterday. Uncertainty of time. I could take you back 60 years to the beginning of modernism in literature. Dostoevsky, Gogol, all of them, the double, the doppelganger. These were before the stream of consciousness, before Virginia Woolf, before all of them, these things were happening. And Camus and Sartre, when they were writing, they were facing the war, the incursions and attempts by Germany. And they were going through a terrible period when the occupation of France was there. So they were also the outsiders of a society. Beckett, Samuel Beckett, was an immigrant to Paris. He was Irish. He went to and never came back to Ireland. And he stayed there. And look at his plays. Silence, absurdity. Will Godot come? Godot never came. But he may come tomorrow. So that's absurdity, hope, and it goes. So that is how modernism began. Realistic literature, descriptive literature does not really have modernism as such. But when you focus the modernistic lens on diaspora and on globalization, we realize that diaspora and globalization are interconnected. The need for globalization to a large extent arose because of the diaspora. The merger of community, communication, the spread of power, the control of power, the fight for power, and the imperial authorities. I want to point out that many of us don't look at European histories, and we need to look at them. Diaspora was there also, war was there also, inequality was there also, imperialism was there also. Finland, there was a Turkish rule. The Ottoman Empire had its own extensive control over many countries. So diaspora is not only Indian or African. Diaspora is not only the Jews. Diaspora is all over the world, and different communities have had their. If we can treat even the British leftovers in India as diaspora, many of them have settled here in hill stations. Many of them had come here as officers, and they died here. They were also diaspora. And memories go back. I could talk about it. William Arnold and many others. If you read their novels, you find out what happened. What they're not lonely. If loneliness is one condition of the diaspora, if being an outsider is one condition of the diaspora, they also were in the same condition, except they had some authority, and we had no authority. So that's one thing. Then let's go a little further. I want to come closer home. Are you familiar with Toba Singh? You may be, Mantos. Saadat Hasan Mantos, Toba Singh. I would look at it as a specific example of modernism and diaspora. There's questioning of the nation. There's questioning of memory. And whatever the name of the man is, I forget the name of the man. He's in an asylum. Bishan Singh is in an asylum, insane asylum, and he has to be brought to India. And he can't understand why that he's being brought to India. And he stands near the barbed wire and he dies there. It's a very powerful symbolism of both diaspora, globalization, under the lens of modernism. How globalization, where territories are being altered because of the major powers, not because of the people themselves. How many of us had a choice, or our ancestors had a choice in the making of partition? Toba Singh is one story which tells you how nationhood is being constructed and how nationhood is being questioned. And diaspora questions nationhood. Modernism questions this nationhood. I also want to go a little further. The term Mahajir, we don't really, it's both a refugee, it's both an outsider, like people who were outside the Muslim majority areas. When they migrated to Pakistan, they were the Mahajirs. They were the outsiders. They were not welcome in terms of employment, in terms of settlement, in terms of economy. They didn't get jobs so easily. And you explore many literature about this period. Emeritus Fellow is a very famous writer. His short stories, City of Sorrow, where identity is lost. Letter from India, where graves are important. That's again a diaspora. You may migrate, but you belong to a place only when there's a birth there and there is a death there, and you have some attachment to the land, especially for those who use burial. Then Basti. They have migrated under pressure of the riots, and they go to Pakistan, and there the old woman of the family, the grandmother, she takes the keys and she keeps on saying, let's go back home. The keys are here. We can go and open the locks. But there's no locks to open. Very powerful novel. And more recently, Munawwar Rana's Mahajirnama, he asked the question that this partition, was it essential? Or Busdili Hamari, or were we cowards that we yielded to it? And बेटे को ले आए, भतीजे को छोड़ आए. that we brought our son and we brought our precious possessions, but we left our relatives, we left our country. So homelands, countries, consciousness, questioning of the nation, they all go with globalization. They all go with the diaspora, and they're all being questioned once again. Now that when you look at the notion of identity, where does identity lie? Where is history? What do we do with the past? The past, which is so difficult that we want to forget it, but it is so important that we have to remember it. And where do we go from here? So let's get back to the subject. And before I end, modernism is a lens. Through this lens, I look at diaspora and globalization. I've checked twice, there is no and between diaspora and globalization. Diaspora, comma, globalization through the lens of modernism. So when we look at it, diaspora is the creation of modernism. And globalization is the alternate, which takes away the soul. And you are not willing to bargain about it. So what do? Ideologies also push you outside. There is Mohsin Hamid's novel, Exit West. Many of you may have read The Fundamentalist, Reluctant Fundamentalist. A very important novel, 2007, if I remember correctly. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, but didn't get it. And the story runs like this, that the narrator, the nameless narrator, been working in America until there was cultural discrimination. Then he decided to go back to his own country because he didn't like to be, he was fair, he looked like a white, but he was treated badly. So and in these circumstances, he decided to come home. Then he takes hold of a visitor American and takes him to a cafe, Lahore Cafe, Dhaba, wayside motel, and gives him a cup of tea where the flies are also coming in, and the whole novel is narrated there. So how your culture pulls you back. Your culture pulls you back and you get back. And that's how it happens. And then later on, 10 years later, he wrote a novel, Exit West, where because of the ideologies of the government, people are migrating. And there are two characters on whom we focus there, Nadira and Sayed. And they decide to migrate. After 3 failed attempts, to finally make it and go. But where do they land up? Obviously, the country is not named, but it is England. And they are in a house full of refugees from Nigeria, from other countries, from Germany, from like that. And they have one room there in that building where the windows are closed, etc. So you find that there is a closed life. They are not happy. They don't communicate much. They hardly relate to each other, but they're migrated together. Then they go from that country to another country, to another country, to another country, another country, and finally, separately, they find their way back home to Pakistan. And now they have nothing to say to each other. Nadira has nothing to say to Sayyid, and Sayyid has nothing to say to her. So they have been losers all along. They have lost all along. But look at the title, Exit West. It is a double-faced title. Exit towards the West, exit the West and go back home, and both journeys fail. Going west, the journey fails. Coming back to Pakistan, the journey fails. It doesn't give you what you want. Your self is lost. So the loss of the self. That is how modernism looks at the diaspora. But I want to, before I end, I want to say one thing. People quarrel with the memories. They want to alter them. They want to capture them like roots. They want to come back home, but they hardly ever come back home. Look at Naipaul. He used hatred as a weapon for alienating himself. Look at Vijay Mishra and Satyendra Nandan, who were in power in politics in Fiji, but then they went to Australia. They didn't come back to India. None of the other. Amitabh Ghosh visits here, half year, half year. Kamila Shamsi visits Pakistan, half year. That's about it. Very rarely you will find a diaspora person coming back, the diasporic person coming back. So that is another eye-opener that we have not really understood the diaspora. Once they are strangers to us, they are strangers to us. They come here, they stay in hotels. They don't stay with their parents. They don't like those bathrooms. They don't like those houses. So they are alienated. Modernism has alienated them, has broken their consciousness into fractures, and they are the losers. You find that they are the losers there, but they are gainers in perhaps economic sense. And all along, both the diaspora, the political power, pushing them from one country to another country, or attracting them from one country to another, it is technology, employment, Silicon Valley, you all remember, I'm not going to dwell on it. Then you have the visa problem. You can't enter a country, you can't leave a country unless they permit you. Then you're illegal immigrants, then you're running away from the law. So, and when you come back home, for a few days, the days may be rosy, but later on it's changed because hard reality has to be faced here again. So the nature of reality is very important. So modernism, but literally modernism, is born out of exile, is born out of doubt, is born out of a double consciousness, is born out of a fractured reality. And globalization has both sides, good side and bad side. Technology has both sides and bad sides. Technology, so much so, the atomic bomb is a very fine example. Then I'm sure lots of things are going to come up in question. I hope I'll be able to clarify some points. I've tried to make it as simple because there are three segments and three segments clashing into each other time-wise, history-wise, and idea-wise. So here you all are. Thank you very much. You expect me to say something? I'm waiting.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for your interesting and insightful presentation. I now hand over the proceedings to Dr. Preeti Sharma. A word of introduction. Dr. Preeti Sharma is Assistant Professor English at Kanodia College, Jaipur. She has done her PhD in linguistics topic. She has 12 years of teaching experience. She has also PG diploma in German, and she has been awarded the Most Creative Teacher Award in 2018. She is an academic counselor with IGNOU and has delivered MOOC sessions with Commissionerate College Education. Over to Dr. Preeti Sharma. You'll take up the questions, which are quite a number, and then proceed to the vote of thanks. Over to Preeti.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, Asha ma'am. Before I put forward the questions, may I take a distinct privilege of extending the heartfelt gratitude to Madam Professor Jasbir Jain for such an insightful session. Thank you so much, ma'am. So the first question is from Mr. Arvind. He asks, how do we overcome the resistance to change the methodologies and materials?
Resistance we face in? Could you repeat that, Preeti?
Yes, ma'am. The question is from Mr. Arvind, how do we overcome the resistance to change the methodologies and materials?
Change the pedagogy and material. From this point of view, from the diasporic point of view, or which material? I wonder how we have to make an effort from scratch. You can't change pedagogy and material like that. If you are looking at some teaching material, or you're looking at the material of life, or you're looking at the social material, then you have to analyze it and you have to work with it accordingly. Uh, the question is not very clear to me.
So I come over to the next question, ma'am. It is from Mr. Shiva. He's asking, does diaspora mean migration, slavery, and economic disturbance only?
It is never an economic disturbance only. It is an escape sometimes from law, a fugitive from, for instance, during the British regime, some Indians also went away abroad to England or to other places because they were escaping from British, for their nationalist activities. They were running away from it. Kamla Markandeya has a novel, The Nowhere Man, where there is a person who was under persecution of for terrorism. He goes away. And we also have an example of Aurobindo. He went to Pondicherry so to escape persecution. So there is no only economics. Economics is when they go only to study and for employment and come back. If they don't come back, it's not economy. It's something more. It's the lure of travel. It's the lure of power. And when the employment is one thing, sure enough, agreed there.
He's also asking, ma'am, does transferable job come under diaspora? Don't you think it helps in cultural exchange and economic prosperity?
What helps in?
He says, does the transferable job come under diaspora?
Transferable job.
Transferable job. Does it come under diaspora? And don't you think it helps in cultural exchange and economic prosperity?
I don't really know. Conspirating, what does the person mean? You mean some terrorist job or something like that?
Transferable.
Huh?
Transferable.
Transferable.
Yeah, transferable.
They are not particularly diaspora. Transferable job, like, let me give you an example. Shashi Tharoor. If you are in the UN or you are an ambassador, that is not diaspora. Is that clear?
Yes, ma'am. So, Mr. Thakur, Dr. Thakur asks, Indian literature talks of Vasudeva Kutumbakam. Isn't it globalization in itself?
Preeti, could you repeat it? What is not globalization?
Indian literature talks of Vasudeva Kutumbakam. Isn't it globalization in itself, ma'am?
Indian literature, no. Literature itself is not globalization. Literature, even if it talks about the rest of the globe, is not globalization. Globalization is movement, is technology, is economics and politics. Literary things, journeys are there. Now, if T.S. Eliot migrated to England, stayed there, that doesn't mean that it's globalization. Or many people during the Second World War, many Jews went to America and settled there. That is not globalization. From one point of view, I'll agree that shifting of population when they are brought to one other place, it does contribute to globalization.
I'll come to the next question, ma'am. Dr. Anil Kumar Mishra is asking, what is, in your opinion, what would be the difference between globalization and globalism?
Globality.
Globalization and globalism. What is the difference between these two, ma'am?
Yeah, I understand. Globalization is also a finished act. And globalism. I really don't know. What do you mean by globalism? Globalism, I thinking of the world in and not of oneself, thinking in larger terms, breaking the barriers of caste and nation and moving across, could be. I'm guessing. I don't know what you mean.
I come to Ms. Pragya's question, ma'am. She's asking, diaspora and globalization are interlinked that create intercultural competence. What is the role of globalization in this whole scenario? Should I repeat, ma'am? I'll repeat the question. diaspora, and globalization are interlinked, that create intercultural competence. What is the role of globalization in this whole scenario?
Globalization is a recent phenomenon. If you go back to 1950 or 1949 or 51, it's not a very old phenomenon, and it's only been there for 70 years. Many factors may have added to it, but I've already pointed out that the environment meet summit told us very clearly that globalization is only uh, technological and employment, Silicon Valley, etc. And economics because import and export of goods. Otherwise, it has not. The pandemic has shown you that globalization has its negative effects.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Ms. Anupama. She says, do you think history could be taught through diasporic literature, since they are chronicles of the happenings of the time and also records of the memories of people who were displaced due to the power of equations of their time? So do you think history could be taught through diasporic literature?
To some extent, that is quite correct. Because don't we read Giriraj Kishore's Pehla Gir Mitiya? That's a diasporic vision. How others look at you and how you look at them. Burmese Days, George Orwell. So these are examples. So when literature students get to know them, perhaps other students don't. They get to know only about the wars and about victory. But senior students of history would be reading them already. Next.
Separated from flock by Syed. Okay. Mr. Mahendra Kumar is asking, what world do we live in now? How do you see our present time?
How do we see ourselves?
Present time.
He's asking, ma'am, his question is basically, what world do we live in now?
Void, huh?
Yeah. So how do you see our present time?
The void here, the emptiness here, is a kind of an inner emptiness. And that is because our collection society is loosening. Because we, like Mohsin Hamid's novel, we are not finding a continuity and a connection with the outer reality in our life. Many of us are not finding that meaning in our outer life. So there is a void. We are outsiders in our own society.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think the answers have satisfied all the participants. We are already elated with joy to see you here with us live. And everybody is very happy. We can see that in the chat box. So I'm elated again to have this noble task of extending the vote of thanks to all those who materialized this webinar, number 60, on the topic Diaspora, Globalization through the Lens of Modernism. And I extend my humble gratitude to our honorable speaker for today's webinar, Madam Professor Jasbir Jain, our role model, our inspiration. We are highly indebted to you, ma'am, for conducting this session today. I also thank Sir Dr. Sanjay Arora, President, National ELTAI, Professor Shravan Kumar, Vice President, National ELTAI, and Dr. Ilango, Secretary, National ELTAI, for their persistent support and motivation. I thank Sir Professor Mohan Raj, Professor Ramani, and Madam Dr. Bandana for their guidance and vision. I also thank Dr. Asha and the technical support team, Dr. Praveen Sam and Dr. Xavier. Vote of thanks remain incomplete if I do not acknowledge the presence of ELTAI members and all other participants who have joined the webinar today and made it successful. Thank you, everyone. I hand over the platform to Dr. Sam now. Over to Dr. Sam.
Thank you, Preeti ma'am. Dear participants, thank you very much for participating in this webinar. The webinar for the next week. Preeti ma'am, can you please close your cam because your window is...
Sure.
Thank you. The webinar for the next week is titled Posters, Tagline and Loglines. ideas from the world of movies. The resource person is Mr. Robert Hill, author, editor, and teacher trainer. So I welcome all the participants to participate in this seminar as well and get enlightened. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.